So, as we said, the session title is called "Closing Down a Museum Site," and then Paul Storch has been with the Minnesota Historical Society Facilities, Historic Property Sites, Collection, and Exhibits Liaison since 2009. Before that, he managed the Daniels Object Conservation Lab in the History Center for 18 years as Senior Objects Conservator. He is responsible for managing the collections and exhibits at 26 sites around the state, which includes preventative conservation, installation, and deinstallation of exhibits, acquisitions, inventories, and disaster planning. So, Paul, thank you again for making the time to put this session together, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Thanks. You're welcome. All right. Here's my contact information. So if there's any specifics, what I'll be talking about today is fairly general. I tried to make it general for all kinds of museums and sites around the state using some of our MNHS site-specific information and some of the actions we've taken so far. But if there's anything particularly you'd like to go over, I'd be happy to do that. So email is the best contact right now. So let's see. Oh. All right. A few, just to get started, I figured we'd do some definitions because there's two levels of closure technically. So what we're talking about right now due to this pandemic is closure versus mothballing. And to define those terms, to use them as technical specific terms, closure would be closing building sites, museums based on an emergency, short-term closure, or an extended closure. But the goal is to reopen at some point, which is to be determined by management, by government, et cetera, as we're seeing right now. Some of the aspects of closure are collections and exhibits can remain with some exceptions, as I'll get to later on, but they generally don't need to be removed. I'm getting some feedback. Need to be removed from the buildings of the site. You maintain your minimal facilities and preservation operations, and as I saw earlier from when Todd went over the survey results, that a fair amount of institutions are that responded are actually, or at least the beginning of the shutdown order directive was maintaining their collections procedures and things like that within the buildings. Depending on the reason for closure, reopening can involve various time and monetary expenditures. That's just something to consider. We'll talk about reopening considerations later on. Reopening after a pandemic, in this case, will involve extra time and supply expenses, and may involve capacity limitations different from after a, quote, normal closure. What I mean by how this closure is different from say after a minor disaster or a state shutdown is there aren't necessarily some of the cleaning concerns that'll be involved with this one. So just some aspects of that. I think I skipped a slide. Hang on just a second. Sorry about that. I go here. Okay. Well, one of my slides disappeared. Anyway, the mothballing is much more of a permanent closure. Pretty much long term, what you want to do is remove the collections and exhibits from the building to secure location. You remove your operating equipment, your office equipment, that type of thing. Basically, you're maintaining a building envelope for long term. You do maintain the grounds outside, and some of the HVAC for minimal. You keep the building envelope from falling apart, maintain the roof, that type of thing. But basically everything else, all programming, materials, records, all that is out there. So it's really quite different from the kind of closure we're doing right now. And there is a excellent reference from the National Park Service, technical brief number 31. And I've got that link in the resources, so you can refer to that for mothballing, because there's a lot more involved with that. Let's see here. So let's talk about some assumptions that I've based what I'm talking about on for this going forward. The current closure should be temporary, so closure in this context is different from mothballing, as we talked about in the definitions. Plans for shutting down your buildings or closure should be part of your standard operating procedures and incorporated with your business continuity and disaster preparedness plans, as Ann talked about this morning. Your buildings and sites are closed to the public, but the assumption is that there'll be some staff, and depending on the particular institution situation, that could be paid and or volunteers, still have some access. It's probably limited. Essential services, so that would be HVAC maintenance, integrated pest management or IPM, your security system monitoring, landscaping will continue for the duration of the closure. So getting into some facilities and general type of guidelines, post signs on the property informing the public about the closure, provide some contact information, and of course post that online. And again, those type of concerns and actions were talked about a little bit earlier, so it just showing how this fits in with collections and buildings concerns as well. Secure your gates, any outbuildings. I know some county museums have cabins and other types of buildings on their museum properties, so you want to make sure those are secure. And shut down temporarily, block the windows, that type of thing, as you would for your main building. And also other features, make sure those are secure. If possible, move large functional objects on your grounds to safety or more secure storage, such as wagons, other types of objects that could be moved. Obviously, sculpture, things like that, really couldn't do that. So if you can secure those with temporary fencing, if you see that as a risk for security, or through vandalism or theft or anything, if it's possible. Then other security issues would be to get keys from your staff or volunteers who will not be around during closure, will be working from home, and change the alarm codes. That's a good practice anyway to do periodically. So if that hasn't been done for a while, this is a good time to do that. Also, other things on the checklist would be to contact essential vendors to coordinate service schedules during the closure. So that would be with pest management visits, HVAC service, and of course some of them will be having their own closure procedures or changes in schedule. I know I oversee our integrated pest management for sites. And the vendor we work with was closed for a couple of weeks, March through beginning of April, and then they started ramping up service visits again with some changes to their staffing. I'm noticing different tech names coming up on our invoices. So, but generally our schedule wasn't disrupted that badly. And I also gave them our change in contacts and scheduling to make sure that we were all on the same page with that. So that took a little bit of scrambling to do, but with fairly short lead time, but that's a fairly important thing to do. And then adjust your staff schedules to do at least basic cleaning and maintenance tasks in and around the buildings. Schedule regular perimeter checks for security, daily if possible, and weekly at a minimum. Again, as I mentioned, maintain the landscaping. That's for, appearance purposes, security, and also fits into integrated pest management, to make sure the weeds are away from the building and air conditioning units, that kind of thing. Remove all of food from the premises if possible. If not, make sure it's in tight containers so mice and other things can't get in. Shut down appliances and office machinery. Unplug things, make sure everything's secure. You don't want to increase any kind of fire risk. And turn off lights for energy savings, except those for security. Check the functionality of the alarm system. Again, it's something that should be done regularly. It's a good time to do that now. And then adjust your heating, air conditioning, HVAC set points to save energy. We've increased our unoccupied set points at our sites, except in those that have dedicated storage spaces, already set up for tighter limits than the rest of the building. So those we've kept the same, but the office areas, some of the exhibit spaces, we've increased those unoccupied set points to save heating and air conditioning. But we have specified to keep where we have standalone dehumidifiers to actually keep those going. And that would be another thing to put on the checklist to make sure that there's no leaks and those are functioning properly. So we want to keep the humidity in check, but the heating and cooling can be adjusted for energy savings in buildings that have full HVAC systems. I know at the History Center, there's been an increase in outside air intake. And if there are going to be people in the building, that's one of the things being recommended for virus control is increased ventilation. But that is going to affect your indoor air quality in terms of preservation. So talking more specifically about collections concerns, so return loans if there's enough lead time. If not, contact the lender, most likely going through the same thing. So they should be understanding about that and might have some, questions about securing their items and how to deal with that. Remove sensitive high value objects from display and place in a secure storage. We do that anyway with some of our sites displays that are in various buildings at sites anyway for the off season. So this year they should be back in place this time of the year. But they'll they're still in secure storage. So, and then if possible, pull shades and secure shutters in the buildings to limit light, and also deter people looking in for opportunistic threats, that are thefts, that type of thing. Cover cases and furniture again to limit light and dust. Can use muslin on unbleached muslin works fine for that, or sheets. Check, this is a good opportunity to check all your door sweeps and adjust or repair those. If there's not time to do that before closure, that could be something that's put on the maintenance list to get done. That's for obviously dust, water control, and pest control. And then if there's any kind of risk of leaks, particularly in storage areas, cover items and shelves with plastic sheeting. If something does happen and somebody can't get to it right away, this is time of year we could get a fair amount of rain, so that's a good precaution. And then what should be done anyway is make sure objects are off the floor and storage areas, blocked up on wood. So that's something to make sure before closure that gets done. Continue to monitor temperature and relative humidity with loggers. If you've got those going, don't stop doing that, and analyze the data on your regular schedule. Generally, for us, that's monthly. We've got some sites where we were having issues with some of our systems, so I've had our site techs send that in weekly so I can monitor the repairs on that and make sure they're functioning. And also, if you do change the set points, to see how those are working, and how those might be affecting the objects, and if you have to readjust them. So that's a good thing to keep going. And right now there are different companies. We use Hobo Loggers, which is Onset Corporation, and they're having webinars to talk about their Wi-Fi equipment. And we have Bluetooth loggers. We don't have, because of logistics and the way our buildings are constructed and all, Wi-Fi it's a little beyond what we'd want to do right now. So we access our logger data with flash drives, and since we do have people on site during closure, they can get to those loggers, and we have a few that are on Bluetooth, but that still necessitates going into the building. But for the long term and future closures, if you were interested, there's plenty of resources to eventually switch to a Wi-Fi system so you could monitor remotely. Make sure your IPM equipment is maintained and checked, both prior to and during the closure. So that would be if you're using bait boxes outside and any kind of live traps or sticky traps inside, get those checked and changed out if necessary. Then make sure that you have your most recent inventory lists accessible if needed, either online, or even if you can't do that, hard copy. So if something does happen during closure, you can easily check that and do inventory updates. Notify potential donors I would suggest doing a moratorium on donations until further notice. May get drive-by drop-offs. Hopefully that won't happen, but that's something you'll have to deal with. during reopening, but I think it's best just to kind of uh, put a pause on that for night. Right now, there's enough other stuff to do than to have to process donations right now. Then cleaning during closure, the extent may be dependent on the supply chain for cleaning products and cloths, personal protective equipment. So that may be a limiting factor. It depends, how much you had on hand already. I know we donated a fair amount of our PPE, masks, and we had some Tyvek suits that we use for lead mitigation at sites to hospitals back in March when there was a call for that. We kept some reserves on for our use once we start back up, but uh, and then we did wind up redistributing some of our cleaning materials to different sites in our network. So uh, the amount of extra cleaning may be dependent on that, but you should have enough to do the minimal amount. And if possible, given your staffing, again, that's a consideration, continue the regular minimal daily, weekly, and monthly cleaning routine. I know there's been questions and concerns in museums about what's been called deep cleaning or disinfecting, and there even been questions on some of the forums that I'm on about electrostatic spraying devices with disinfectants, and obviously the manufacturers and distributors of those have seen a major opportunity to market those things, particularly to public institutions. And there have been some collections people that have gone on the forum saying, should we do this? And definitely not for collections. Whether it's necessary for public areas or not, that's something you have to determine. Obviously, with spraying disinfectants, you're going to affect different materials. So it might be appropriate for areas that have been, especially for reopening. But after we've been closed for at least 9 days. That's the current guideline for deactivation of the virus. So at this point, there really isn't any need for disinfecting, deep cleaning. And that's can go aspects of disinfecting and deep cleaning is actually could do a whole hour on that. So I don't want to spend too much time, but I thought I'd mention that because I know there's been a concern about having to do that at this point, and it's really not necessarily. For any kind of cleaning, of course, staff should use their regular personal protective equipment, follow directions for use of products. And then just fairly briefly, because it's still details are changing and there's a lot we don't know of actually how this will happen, and it'll depend on state government and governor's directives and your specific situation. But we'll need to determine the level of reopening, uh, hours and staffing and how many people can be let in. Do we open buildings or just grounds? That type of thing, and that's going to vary from site to site and all. So need to follow the state and local guidelines for the logistics. That would be the hours, capacity, social distancing, any other safety precautions. Walk through your spaces and inspect for any changes or problems, once we do get the go ahead. Do IPM inspections, both interior and exterior, to see if any insects, rodents got in, caused any damage, both the building or collections. Then return the HVAC set points to your regular settings that would, in some cases, are occupied and unoccupied settings. And then reinstall the objects that anything has been put in secure storage. Those can go back on display. It's a good time to do any kind of rotations if you were able to finish planning for those during the closure. Those could be incorporated. Then some other concerns with collections and exhibits would be to modify your tour programs if needed to keep visitors further away from historic surfaces to avoid any extra cleaning needs, because our programming most likely will change going forward after this. There are concerns about second wave, and so social distancing will most likely be in place for a while. So that's something to consider in protecting collections, would be to not so much as closing off rooms, but limiting visitor access. So, and with smaller groups, if we'll be limiting capacity or doing time ticketing, you'll have smaller groups in, say, a historic house at any given time now. So it would be a little easier to rope off a doorway and just have people look in and move, rotate through. Whereas before, with larger groups, that's not as not as easy or as good for your program. But that's something to consider, and that if there happens to be a contamination incident, you're really lowering, or somebody coming in who could cause that, you're really lowering the risk of needing to isolate your collections and do any deep cleaning. Consider shutting down high-touch interactives for a while. Restart or startup of those can be based on CDC guidelines for public spaces and state of Minnesota guidelines that'll be forthcoming once we see how this reopening is shaping up. And then in the resources, number 2 is an excellent checklist and a task outline for different reopening scenarios. It's written out in three different types of reopening levels. So you could take a look at that and incorporate that into your plan for reopening. And just to go over some of the resources here. I've been looking, and there's a number of different webinars that have all been recorded now. I would suggest going to the first one is the National Park Service. It's the National Center for Preservation Testing and Technology, and there's 3 of those. There's the COVID-19 basics and closure, and then this one is the third one is basics on re-entry to cultural sites. So that's a good one to look at. And then the re-entry checklist is that second one, Curie collections. So you really don't need to invent a lot on your own. You can just plug that in there, and it's good to have a written plan. And the way this checklist is developed, it's very similar to disaster recovery, where there are different teams spelled out for the different tasks and different functions. So there's teams for dealing with staffing and the financial end of reopening, and the collections, and then exhibits teams, and then even like the public facing functions such as food service, catering, that type of thing. And then also the Australian guidelines are very helpful for dealing with both closure and then the reopening. And again, those are spelled out in a very organized fashion. So it's something you could use and adapt. And then the last one is the preservation technical brief that I mentioned on mothballing. And within each one of these references is why I just put the links here. They have further resources and links to go to, and that's why I didn't spell all of those out. I could have had several pages of pertinent resources, but you'll be able to go to those websites, and as they're being updated, as this the situation evolves, you'll be able to link into the current information on those resources. So that's what I've got. If we want to do questions at this point.
Thanks, Paul. We haven't gotten any questions into our chat box yet, but I hope people will feel free to start adding some now that you're finished presenting. I have a question for you. Yes. You mentioned that you could talk for an hour about cleaning, and I have seen you have seen a lot of questions on different forums about how to sanitize spaces for coronavirus before people start working or visitors start entering. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how the buildings and the sites that you oversee will be dealing with cleaning.
Right. Well, since the public has been out, well, we're going on almost 2 months right now, but if we open June 30th, and some sort of phased opening, it's been closed for three months or so. So there's not, going by all the medical information we have now, there should not be any live viruses on any surfaces. So, and collections that weren't in contact with the public to begin with don't need any kind of disinfecting. We've had minimal staff going in, and they should have been cleaning the whole time. So really just your regular cleaning to remove dust, and touch any surfaces that were touched. So the basics of cleaning is to remove grime and dirt first. So it would be wet cleaning with soap and water, rinsing, and then if there's any risk of a contamination, then you use a disinfectant, which would be the safest for most surfaces, even non-collection surfaces, are the quaternium ammonium compounds, or quats. And early on in this, we received a list from the Center for Biological Chemistry, I believe it is, that were EPA approved disinfectants, and we've got that linked in our enhanced cleaning document, and we've posted that on various forums, and I've been sending those out on request, and that's in those list of those products, and acceptable products are in some of the resources in my presentation. So, and we can make those available. So it's just to recap, just a basic cleaning that you would do normally. And then once reopened, then it would be your high touch surfaces and probably stepped up vacuuming because we know the virus can settle in dust, and you want to control that anyway for normal hygiene purposes. So that's, I think does that answer the question pretty much?
Yeah, thank you. Do you do your vacuuming with a HEPA filter in these situations?
That would be, yes, that would be the best thing to do. There's some discussion in that, and some of the things I've watched, and probably the best resources for that would be the NCPTT videos, and those are up on YouTube. It's a conservation scientist from the center there talks about that. But yeah, the HEPA at a minimum is the best thing, because that they're fairly readily available now, and I would think most people are using them anyway, since they've always been recommended for cleaning collection, particularly in collections areas.
Okay, I've got a couple questions for you from our chat box. Teresa asked, has there been any discussion regarding screening visitors, requiring face masks, etc., as part of reopening plans?
That, from what I know, we're still working on that for MNHS, so I don't want to comment on that right now. We'll probably know more soon on that, and if we can, we could do that as part of outreach as far as what we're doing. I think we're really waiting to see what the state requires on that. And as far as staff, I'm not sure. I think we're just going by what CDC is recommending right now.
Great. Here's another question. Jessica asked, high-touch area in a historic house is the staircase railing. How do we clean and sanitize without damaging the wood? Or really the wood finish, I guess she's probably asking.
Right. So that is if she's talking, I'm assuming that's an original staircase, because in some of our sites we've put in to preserve the stairway itself, we've put in a modern railing, so that's not a real issue. But you want to avoid anything with alcohol in it, of course. Probably a good assumption that the wood's finished with shellac, so that would mess up the finish on that. The best thing is, again, soap and water. Will get, it's not a disinfectant, but if you think you need to disinfect, if there's any indication there might be a contamination, then the soap and water, rinse, dry, and then you could go over it with a something using a quaternium ammonium compound. That's, you're going to have to look at the product itself, the product information, and see if it is recommended for wood surfaces or not. But I would avoid having disinfect if you can. But if you think there has been some contamination, then you may have to go beyond just cleaning, just regular cleaning for that. But make sure you do dry quickly, and then there shouldn't be any problems.
Great. Okay, I have more questions for you. Some of these might be a little hard for you to answer, but you can always pass on them and we can figure out a different way to answer them. Okay. Joseph asks, we at Firefighters Hall and Museum have 3 exhibits that specifically belong to the MHS. If we were to close for an extended period of time, should we return the exhibits to MHS?
And I'm very familiar with that. Yeah, in that case, that is a question for our collections management people who will be coming on soon.
Yeah.
Todd, and that would be a registrar question. So I'll let them handle that.
Great. Ask that again in about 20 minutes.
Right. That's a great question for that. I'm not sure I have an idea how they'll respond, but I'll let them deal with that.
Thanks. Okay. Sherilyn asks, is there somewhere we can send out reopening protocol? The one I wrote covers visitors, staff, buildings, and public communication. I think she's asking if someone could look at it for anything that she has missed. That's a hard question for Paul. But I think that maybe Todd Mahan might want to jump in too.
Yeah, I could certainly, if there's anything, Todd could handle that, and then if other people want to do that, and there's anything about collections, I could certainly help out with that. But like I've said, we're still working on that, and it's developing, and it all depends on capacity and all. There'll be certain things, like I mentioned in the last few slides, that are pretty standard for any kind of reopening after a closure. But we could certainly look at specifics.
There are some websites that have been publishing examples of reopening protocols, so it's also worth comparing yours against other people's. But yeah, I'd also remind people that there's a reopening conversation, 2 of them taking place tomorrow, hosted by the Minnesota Alliance of Local History Museums. So if you want to pop your reopening questions then to the group that gathers, it would probably be a great place to get some feedback.
Right, and I just saw AASLH is having a reopening webinar on the 20th at 2 p.m. Central Time. There is a minimal fee for that. I think members are $5, non-members are $10, but they'll waive the fee. So that looked to me from the description more of staffing, personnel, and public concerns for reopening rather than more technical collections, but it might be worth looking at that next week.
Okay, I have a couple more questions that I'd like to get to you. Nicole asks if purchasing a hand sanitizing station would be prudent even with a staged opening. And I'll just add, because I know that in Manitoba, which recently reopened their museums, they required all museums to have hand sanitizer available throughout the museum when they reopened. So I don't know if you have anything to add, Paul.
No, I'd agree with that. I think it's more practical than getting gloves for everybody. So yeah, and that's another good resource. Is the I also look. Well, I was on the live webinar for that, the Canadian one on closures and openings. So that's another good written resource to look at, is the protocols from Manitoba. But yeah, I think we'll be doing that as well, as making that available in MNHS sites.
Okay, Joseph asks, what is the best way to clean and disinfect vehicles that are on display? I'm guessing that they're on open display in their museum. And I'm guessing people are touching those vehicles.
Well, I think prior to closure, I don't, other than regular maintenance type cleaning, there doesn't need to be any disinfecting. After reopening, if there's any way you can restrict, I think for the foreseeable future, next year to 18 months at least, I think restrict touching is really the only way to do that. If they're, particularly if they're accessioned objects, if they are program use, then that's another consideration. You know, they're expendable. It really depends on materials. Again, it would be if you had to disinfect, do the wet cleaning, and then followed by a wipe down with a product that is compatible with painted surfaces. You just have to look at what the product is recommended for. Some are recommended for, and particularly non-porous surfaces. Generally, if they're porous surfaces, then it's best to restrict touching if you can at all.
Great comment. I will read out loud for people who have joined us by phone that Todd Mahan noted that supplies for reopening are in short supply. He's hearing 6 to 8 weeks for things like plexi and sanitizer.
Right.
So good idea to be ordering that now. And I have one more question that I want to get to, and then we'll pause until 2 p.m. when we have our Q&A with collections management, which again, many of these questions will be well answered by them. So continue thinking of questions. This question is from Celeste, who asks, would plastic cling wrap on railings and other high touch surfaces at historic sites be safe for the wood?
That's an interesting question. I hadn't really thought about that. Possibly, I'd have to think about that more. I don't know if I'd recommend it, particularly as humidity increases. You'd have to look at the particular situation. But if you're talking about polyethylene, that may work. It's certainly going to disturb the appearance. So it might be an option to think about that.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
I thank you so much for presenting here and answering so many questions.